So good evening, everyone. Welcome to Citylet's virtual event and celebration of the book launch for the Joshua Generation, Israeli Occupation in the Bible by Rachel Havrelock. It's here, lovely book. And we're pleased that she's in conversation with Ethan Michaeli. Rachel is an associate professor of English at the University of Illinois. She's the author of River Jordan, The Mythology of a Dividing Line, and the co-author of Women on the Biblical Road, Ruth, Naomi, and the Female Journey. She lives in Chicago. Ethan is the author of The Defender, How the Legendary Black Newspaper Changed America. It was praised by the New York Times as a towering achievement that will not soon be forgotten, and awarded Best Nonfiction Prizes by the Chicago Writers Association, and listed as Notable Book of the Year by the Washington Post and the New York Times. He is a lecturer at the Harris School of Public Policy of the University of Chicago, as well as a senior advisor at the Golden Institute. His forthcoming book is 12 Truths and Peril in a New Israel. Please join me in welcoming them both to a virtual City Lit event tonight.
Well, thanks so much for having us. City Lit is a wonderful bookstore. Those of you who check it out, if you're in the Logan Square area, you guys are open and accepting people, or?
We're just doing curbside pickup now, so you can call and order books. We can ship them if you're not here, or even if you are here and you want them shipped, or we're doing curbside pickup.
Great. So please support our independent bookstores. We need them in Chicago. We need them everywhere. It's very important that we keep the independent bookstores strong and part of our community through this period especially. I'm going to start welcoming all of you, of course, and thanking you for joining us again. But I'm going to show this gorgeous cover of Rachel's book, and congratulations to Rachel. This is the day one of the book's debut. So it's a very special day for authors. It's really I remember when my book came out, it was very emotional day. So Rachel, congratulations to you, and best of luck to this book. I'm sure it's going to find an incredible readership and provoke all the conversations that you hope it will. But to begin our conversation, again, want to show this beautiful cover, both to encourage you to buy it and to suggest that although the old adage says, do not judge a book by its cover, this book is as gorgeous as its cover. So I strongly recommend that you buy it, read it, and then display it, because it's got really a kind of special look to it as well. Rachel, could you tell us about what the cover is and where you found it?
Certainly. First of all, again, thanks everyone for coming and sharing this day with me. So many great friends and people here, and so many people whose conversations and energy and thoughts have formed this book. So it really, really is wonderful. And thank you, City Lit. Truly a great bookstore. I have been happy ever since your doors opened, and it's really an honor to get to have this Zoom experience together with and I would be remiss, both Fred Appel and Kate Hensley from Princeton University Press are on the line, and my gratitude abounds because not only that the book is out, but this book is out and realized amidst a pandemic and major global sharing, and they kept this momentum going, and I'm just so thankful. And the cover of the book, right, we're all showing it to you, is a selection from a mural. And the mural is photographed and depicted in its entirety on page 176 of the book. It's a kind of an incredible piece of urban archaeology. Not that the mural dates to biblical times. Our best dating puts it in 1960s Israel. But from everything that I've been able to learn about this mural, well, let me back up a little bit. There is a street that runs through North Tel Aviv that's called Joshua Ben Nun Street. Joshua Ben Nun is the namesake of the biblical book and my own. And David Ben Gurion, Israel's founder, who we'll be talking about, amidst his Bible mania, commissioned these pieces of public art. So as an artwork, it's a very intricate mural mosaic that is on the side of a supermarket. And it's in this kind of derelict state, kind of yellowing with plants growing over it. And you can see air conditioners jutting into it, but it is an image that also kind of in many ways depicts the whole drama of the book of Joshua in modern Israel, and that you see this nicely clad group of warriors dressed in clothes similar to those designed by Moshe Dayan's wife, Ruth Dayan, in her Canaanite style in the 1960s. So you see these kind of intricately clad warriors marching out. And then let's see if everyone can see it here from the inside. Bowing before them, I don't know if it's coming up this way, but bowing before them prostrate are the mosaic figures depicting the Canaanites, right? Those groups felled by Joshua's army. And so in many ways, the mosaic depicts this kind of fantasy of prowess and domination by the Israeli army. But if we put the mosaic in context, it's also yellowing with the runoff of air conditioners in bougie North Tel Aviv. So, you know, you kind of get the like myth in its sort of forgotten disuse amidst a kind of a setting of extreme late cat. It's just an arresting image. I took a friend there last summer on a kind of pilgrimage who lived close by and had never noticed it before. So like the myth itself, the mosaic has this real hiding in plain sight effect. And when my editor, Fred Appel, who's here with us, when he became just as taken with this image as I was, he said, you know, we're going to really need this to be photographed quickly. So one of my oldest friends is an urban planner and attorney, but I also know his past as a photographer, Kevin Dworka. And so I sent him, he was in the region, and I sent him an SOS. You are needed to go photograph a Joshua mosaic. So he dropped everything and kind of had this incredible adventure on the street in North Tel Aviv, shooting this picture, which then had all these passerbys stopping to say, what is this mural? And what's it doing? On the way to production of the book.
Oh, that's lovely. What a great backstory to that beautiful cover. Let's back up just a little bit. Tell us, for those of us like me that are not versed in the biblical texts, who is Joshua and book of Joshua?
Okay, thanks. I'm going to try to be brief on this. So in the biblical narrative, Joshua is the successor of Moses. And in literary terms, there's sort of, Moses is one of the most complex, most tragic, most compelling biblical figures. I think that a lot of the texture of Moses's character has sort of been reduced by Charlton Heston or Christian Bale, oh, I'm forgetting the name, or Val Kilmer, who voiced him in the Prince of Egypt. But you know, really textured, tortured, complex figure. And obviously they are the 5 books of Moses. So Moses is really at the center of a lot of it. Joshua, by way of contrast, is very flat. What we hear about him before the book of Joshua is that he is an apprentice to Moses. He's there by his side. He's sort of always ready to pick a battle. There's a moment of dispute when the people of Israel are wandering in the wilderness about whether or not they should cross the border and engage in endless conflict. And Joshua is one member of a pair who go against the popular will. The popular will is let's not do it, but Joshua and his ready to go and engage in the battles. So he's a rather flat figure, but that said, the 5 books of Moses end east of the Jordan River with Moses's death, an unfulfilled dream of entering the promised land. And Joshua is the successor, non-biological, that we never really know why the successor is Joshua, but he's the one to whom the imperative of leading the people of Israel into the land of Canaan, conquering it, and settling the tribes there, it falls to him. So the book of Joshua tells this story. It tells the story of the people of Israel who've been wandering around in the wilderness with a lot of contention, a lot of rebellion, a lot of resistance, a lot of doubt. And sort of flattens all of it. And the tribes march behind Joshua into the land. And famously, they they bring down the walls of Jericho, they fight all the battles. And the book, and why I think the book is important, is that the first 12 chapters are completely horrific. They talk about genocide, extermination, martial law, rooting out any rebels or opposition. And it's really deeply, deeply disturbing text, and one that I think it's really important to contend with. But the book is also, we might call it like the worst written book of the Bible, but the book is actually much more subtle and complex than that, because these first 12 chapters that talk about conquest and genocide and an army and oppressive maleness, if you keep going in the book, then the second half undermines all of that and presents a very different picture of social structure and cohabitation.
Very, very nice. That is a concise and I think very useful explanation for how we're going to proceed here. The book has its own history of being used in politics, and in more recent history, it was the Israel Ben-Gurion who used the book. Tell us a little bit about how Ben-Gurion used the book and how he interpreted it and what he did with it.
Great. So one piece that I'll just offer up here tonight is that obviously I spent a lot of time puzzling over this biblical book and its strange structure, and ultimately came to the conclusion that the second half of the book of Joshua sort of airs this aspect of the ancient world of households and clans and tribes and peoples inhabiting shared space. But amidst that kind of cohabitation of decentralized, diverse groups, there was at least one party that really wanted centralization. And they probably needed to because of military threat incursions. So the book, I argue, kind of comes into being because there's some kind of nation form out of these decentered tribes and groups. And ultimately, the authors of the book of Joshua get there through this icon of the army. So I sort of argue, like, when you see a lot of pressure and strain on representations of the army, it's not necessarily a sign of a strong country and a strong army, but it could be, you know, this real push towards kind of overcompensation. Let us have this icon of unity and homogeneity because we don't actually have it on the ground. Okay, so that said, the book of Joshua was never really popular in diaspora Judaism. You know, Jews don't read it much in the synagogue. There's not a lot of interpretation of it. Joshua, in Christian interpretation, was taken up really as a forerunner of Jesus. So, like, nobody really dealt that much with the book of Joshua. That is until there was a will out of decentralized Jewish groups from different parts of the world with different traditions from different times and places, until there was a will to form from these groups of Jews, or, you know, whatever we want to call them, to nationalize. And suddenly, in the eyes of early Jewish nationalists, the book of Joshua seemed really valuable. You know, about these wandering groups who form an army and settle a land and establish boundaries. So the book was taken up in a new way among early Zionist thinkers, many of whom kind of read it as a handbook. Because remember, if we're talking about early Zionism, we're talking about Eastern European Jews showing up in a place about which they knew very little. So the book of Joshua informed their experience of the geography and how they related to places, and also, really importantly, the names that they gave to places. So the figure who really loved this book more than probably interpreter before or after was Israel's founder, David Ben-Gurion. He held the book very tight life and to his heart. Okay, but that wouldn't really matter just if David Ben-Gurion liked this book. What really mattered was that on the 10th anniversary of the State of Israel in 1958, when Ben-Gurion found himself presiding over a country of Jewish immigrants and disenfranchised Palestinians, he sort of wondered how he was going to centralize these people. How are you going to get a nation out of a range of different peoples, different languages, Jews from the Arab world who probably had more in common with certain Palestinian communities who were there? And so Ben-Gurion sort of decided, like the writers of Joshua, that she decided to convene the young country's elite, sit down twice a month at his home, and create this public nationalist statist interpretation of the book of Joshua. And this was a key move, not necessarily because it worked, although it did to a certain degree, but because the story of Israel's founding, both internally and for the global press, became coded in the language of Joshua. Oh, Eitan, you're muted. Maybe he has lost the power to unmute himself.
Sorry, I'm back.
Okay.
I muted myself because there was an ambulance. I didn't want that to interfere. The role that the book of Joshua plays in Israeli politics also played out in archaeology. And you tell a riveting story, really a suspenseful story, of the way that this kind of became a part of the struggle or the battle for Israel's past. Can you talk a little bit about that? That's really, as I said, a very suspenseful kind of exciting story.
Okay, so if we're going back to the late 1950s, and incidentally, the year that Ben-Gurion starts his Joshua study group is also the year of Leon Uris's Exodus, that comes out and is a bestseller. It is also the year that Arif el-Arif, a Palestinian historian, coins the term the Nakba, the catastrophe. So you're also getting sort of a language out of the Arab world that's, almost imagining the Palestinians like the ancient Jews and the Israelis like the Romans. So there's a lot of intensity around this story in the late 1950s, and I'll just throw in one last moment for Ben-Gurion. I'll also throw in, okay, and I have to give a spoiler. There are many new biographies of Ben-Gurion out, and every one of his biographer has discovered a different lover that Ben-Gurion had. Like, all these biographies produce lovers of Ben-Gurion, and somehow, like, I came up with his favorite biblical figure of Ben-Gurion to pro-offer here in the book. But I do want to say that it was also kind of a pivotal year for Ben-Gurion, because 2 years later, he had completely flubbed a war, the 1956 Suez War. And so sort of hearkening back to 1948, Israel's founding war, and dressing it in this hyperbolic biblical language was also kind of a brilliant piece of political theater that Ben-Gurion pulled off to kind of conceal his mistake in 1956. Okay, now I will let Ben-Gurion go for the moment, because Eitan asked about archaeology. In the 1950s, as Ben-Gurion was configuring Israeli identity along secular nationalist lines, he saw, and many of his peers saw, that a central ritual for this secular nationalist Jewish identity would be acts of archaeology and a kind of pilgrimage to these ancient archaeological sites. There's so much drama around archaeology and displacement and prospecting. I have a lot to say about that, but let's keep that in the background, because at Ben-Gurion's house, twice a month on Friday, he often did not care if the participants had other plans. He would not let them go when they were in the middle of a discussion of the book of Joshua. At his home, there was a central antagonism that really divided the group. And that was the rivalry between Yigael Yadin, who was the former chief of staff of the Israeli army, the celebrated excavator of sites like Masada and the Joshua location of Hatzor. And Yadin insisted all the way through these, just there had been a single glorious, victorious quest in which Joshua's army defeated their opponents once and for all, prevented them, the opponents being the Canaanites, prevented them from any kind of revival or continuation, and that Joshua was the great general, and that this held the key to what Yadin saw as Israeli greatness, which was investing everything in the army, having it be sort of permanent, having it take on civilian roles, and that it really be the lead institution of the state. Yigael Yadin's rival was Yochanan Aharoni, a German-born figure, and Aharoni insisted that victory was not about a singular blast of successful, but it was a kind of a slow, patient penetration of settlers slowly taking over the land. So again, we're not looking at a kind of a right-left notion here, but rather who prevails? Who are the true heroes? And again, they were always talking about modern Israel as they engaged in these biblical debates. So the real debate was, who are the heroes, the generals or the settlers? Ultimately, at Ben-Gurion's house, Yadin Aharoni left pretty crushed. Although, if we fast forward to today, Aharoni's theories are more respected in academia, whereas Yadin's are not. But this went on to really shape the two interpretations of archaeology in Israel, which became the Jerusalem school and the Tel Aviv school. And just to illustrate how long this rivalry has lasted, I was once on a tour that brought scholars to sites to hear both the Jerusalem and the Tel Aviv interpretation, and staring down into one pit in the earth, the representative of the Jerusalem school said, this shows that there was absolutely a unified kingdom, a King David who had been victorious over all enemies. And the representative of the Tel Aviv school looked down and said, this pit shows us that there was no difference between Israelite tribes and their neighbors, and that they shared a unified culture and lived together side by side.
Excellent. What do we have that's verified from the archaeology? What can we, is the book of Joshua proven to have some historical validity now in the years since?
Such an interesting question, because archaeological validity, or let me say it differently, validating a book of the Bible through archaeology is no less of an interpretive process than figuring out what's true about a biblical book. That is to say that the pot shards and the rock walls that are excavated, I mean, we certainly have tools to date them, but how we see them as indexing culture is also an interpretive move. So the question about, what is true about Joshua from this is really in the eye of the interpreter, because you could go see the self-same ancient wall, and one person would tell you, as Yigael Yadin did, this absolutely shows that there was a conquest and Joshua won it and he burnt everything to the ground and he expelled the Canaanites. And another person will come and say, this city shows that there was a blending of different people in a unified material culture. So, we're sort of just like interpreting the book itself. There's never really any way, I think, outside the politics of interpretation.
That's fascinating, and a really important point for those who want to look back thousands of years and have a kind of certainty about it. It's very difficult to do that in most cases, I suppose. But the book of Joshua, Ben-Gurion's embrace of the book of Joshua in particular, it plays out in Israeli politics beyond his time in office, right? Tell us a little bit about that and how the book of Joshua shaped Israeli politics really up until the present day.
Yeah, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that no book has been more influential in Israeli public life and politics. First of all, because its language so informed modern Hebrew. I mean, just for everyone on here. So the word for Joshua's conquest, kibush, is the word for the Israeli occupation. The word for settlement, for pioneer, for border, as well as the place names for a whole list of Israeli cities and settlements on Palestinian land, they all derive from this book. But again, in this moment in 1958, this was the 10th anniversary, right? Israel's Independence Day, called the Day of Catastrophe by Palestinians, but it was this public ritual. And my point really is that 1948 became coded in the language of Joshua, which means that the way in which Israel's founding was articulated was all through this biblical metaphor. Like I on a kind of a personal note, like people who grew up in Israel at my school in Detroit, we read the book of Joshua in the 4th grade. And, I don't know, it's a very formative year, but I would really kind of puzzle, like, how did the same thing happen twice? Like, maybe that was what really led me to write this book, it was kind of like having to go through all the years of like, how is it in the Bible? And then it happened. The idea that the 1948 war was biblical fulfillment, that was used by Ben-Gurion's study group. And that's the process that I describe in this book, sort of how did the founding of this country and its war become coded this way. So it's very strong in narrative terms, in terms of public ritual. The book of Joshua became key in the Israeli curriculum that later got revised fairly recently. But also the language and the terms of the army also coded the book of Joshua. And, the message was, we're the Joshua generation. We're the people that broke out of exile and the humiliation and the suffering, and we finally became soldiers. And that figuration of Israelis as soldiers, also brought with it, a gender politic, that I think goes hand in hand with the acts of occupation. So a very central book. But here's what happens next. So Ben-Gurion was successful for about 9 years in formulating this unified socialist, statist, militarist. And, his narrative was also taken up by a younger generation, primarily General Mohan, who conquered the West Bank and other territories in the 1967 war. And when Dayan was successful, he started speaking about Ben-Gurion as Moses and himself as Joshua, the true conqueror and redeemer. And this meant that there were other Joshuas waiting in the wings, so that the way to prove oneself as an Israeli leader was, if I can say so, would be to out Joshua the one before, right? To be more militaristic, to have an even more complete conquest, right? To humiliate even more the perceived opposition of Palestinian residents. And after the 1967 war, the groups that really took up the mantle of Joshua were the settlers and leaders of the settler movement. But there was a difference. Whereas Ben-Gurion had wanted the unity of the nation and the army, settler leaders pushed a much more individualistic interpretation. So, in other words, they sort of used Ben-Gurion's nickname was the old man. And, they sort of used the old man's tools of this Joshua narrative ultimately to dismantle the house that he built, which was a centralized state. So in other words, the Joshua competition, became more and more narrow and not about the collective, but about smaller groups pushing for their own agenda against the state. So that ultimately, right, the state became defined as a kind of rival and oppressor. And the idea was to live out the Joshua narrative in real time in an individualistic way.
Very nice, very nice. We have some would-be Joshuas around today. Even, I mean, right now at this particular moment, even in a few hours, we'll have some would-be Joshuas making an announcement about what's called annexation. Can you tell us what is on the table right now for annexation? What do they think? How are they defining annexation, and what? And then we'll talk about maybe what you expect to happen in the next few hours.
Yes. In the strange twist of circumstance,
Or good publishers' timing.
or good publishers' timing, right? Initially, the Joshua generation was going to come out on May 15th. Obviously, we entered a global pandemic, and today is the day of its arrival in the world, and it coincides with an announcement that we'll be hearing soon from Benjamin Netanyahu, which is an announcement about plans for annexation. Annexation, as we saw with Russia in Crimea, is the unilateral taking over, assumption of territory, simply based on the military ability and will of one country. So annexation, or what we're about to hear, is going to be the absorption of yet more territory by the state of Israel from Palestinian private landowners, and also from lands claimed as Palestinian public lands for any kind of future state there. So annexation is basically taking over territory and dismissing any kind of international law. Why tomorrow? Well, came up with his, his peace deal of the century, and Netanyahu mostly didn't listen to it. But what he took from Trump's deal was, or what he read from it, was the right to annex up to 30% of the West Bank. Now, I'm not going to try to get a bunch of maps up now, but anyone who wants to see maps, and there are a lot of original maps in the book, but we have to really be clear about one thing. We are not talking about unified space, right? There's no unified geography of Israel. And there's also no real divided geography of Israel and Palestine. The geography is one of enclaves, of islands, of Palestinian cities walled off against their will, of settlements walled off because they so desire it in the name of security. So it's a world of enclaves. So what annexation means on this very day is it means sort of reducing the size of Palestinian enclaves, cutting off Palestinian, let's call them enclaves, because that is what they have effectively become through the occupation, cutting them from each other, cutting them off from Israeli communities, and cutting them off from the rest of the world. So, Netanyahu's annexation is just more walling and more division and more cutting off. Should I go to what I think is going to happen tomorrow?
Yeah, tell us that. Tell us this is the prime minister is going to make an announcement, or presumably will make an announcement, as hinted or suggested that he will make an announcement tomorrow.
Yeah. So I think that there's going to be a difference between what Netanyahu says in a few hours and what's going to happen. I think that the end game of this, and this dovetails with my other research interest in water, but I think the upshot is going to be the Israeli absorption of the Jordan River Valley, as well as the water, which is under the ground in the West Bank, the Eastern Aquifer. So I think there's going to be a massive, debilitating absorption and really theft of natural resources away from Palestinian communities. That's going to be the upshot. And I want to say right now that not only is that against international law and any kind of sense of rights or justice, but what it also does is facilitate the privatization of those resources. In other words, taking them away from everyone. All those enclave communities are going to see their access to resources reduced, as well as their own rights eroded. Okay, so I think that's going to be the end game of all of this. I think what is likely to happen tomorrow or in a few hours is more that Netanyahu is going to give himself the right to do it. I don't think we're going to necessarily see the tanks rolling into the Jordan Valley tomorrow, but I think what we're going to see is that kind of discursive legal process to get this rolling, and that annexation is going to happen sort of bit by bit, and a kind of that actually makes it much harder to oppose.
That's very fright provocative. So I'm sure that there'll be questions about that. Before we turn things over to questions, though, let me ask you about the dedication to the book. To Michael Feige, the professor who was a friend of yours. Tell us about why who Michael was and why you dedicated the book to him.
Yeah, thank you. Michael Feige was a wonderful friend and colleague, also a scholar of the Bible in Israel, someone who really knew everything about Ben Gurion, who studied archaeology and its role in Israel as well as in the conflict, but really an unparalleled scholar of the conflict itself, who could sit with settlers and patiently listen to them and try to understand them, and then go and sit with Peace Now activists and patiently and understand where they were coming from. So he was really someone, a great scholar of the conflict, who was able to do, I have not ever met able to do what he was able to do, which was truly to listen and process and to put his own stakes in the conflict to the side and really in a scholarly way analyze the conflict and provide remarkably useful materials in understanding the different dimensions of all of this. Really an impeccable scholar and someone who who's really concerned with public memory and what we commemorate and how we do so, how that shapes the kind of country and communities in which we live. I have many great, mostly, so many memories of just walking and talking with him and stopping at memorials and commenting on them. And I believe summer of 2016, he was killed in an attack in a Tel Aviv cafe, and I mean, just such a loss and such a tragedy. I feel it very strongly personally. I think for the field and for the world's understanding of this conflict, I mean, I wish I could speak to him tonight, and I wish we could all hear what he had to say. But it has this just, this uncanny, surreal aspect of what everyday war really means, which everyday war really means that sometimes the people that understand the war the best can be swallowed up by it in such a random way. So a lot of this book was formed in dialogue with him. So almost a surreal aspect that turned out to be our last in-person conversation was outside Ben Gurion's home. So the last time I saw him, there we stood. So, so much of the book results from that, and it's dedicated to him. And I can only hope to one day have the kind of patience and maturity that he really had in analyzing this endless war.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that will ground us in this conversation. I know we have a couple of questions, so maybe we'll turn to them and let's see how that unfolds.
So we have a question from Ellen. How did Golda Meir fit with this Joshua personality?
Okay, so this is the question about Golda Meir, prime minister in the early 1970s. And I'll tell you, there's a passage in the book. Obviously, like any book talk, there's a lot to say, and I say it in the book, and I'm not saying it all here, but one of Ben Gurion's ideas is that we're eternally indigenous to the land, and he goes through that in the study group, and it's here in the book. But as the study group was concluding, Ben Gurion started imagining, what happens in the Bible after the age of Joshua, because Ben Gurion thought he was Joshua. He called Theodor Herzl Moses. He was Joshua. Dayan bumped him back, of course, so that Ben Gurion figured as Moses. But when Ben Gurion still had his Joshua position, started reflecting on the Bible, and he said, after the era of the great leader, the one who gathers the tribes and settles them and wins the war and brings everyone together, he said there's a very fragmented time that follows. And Ben Gurion said this fragmented time came in the era of the prophetess Devorah. Like in the Bible, there's Joshua, and later there are these prophets, and one is Devorah. He's like, yes, in the age of the prophetess, everything really becomes unhinged, and the tribes separate, and they lose this unity. So I don't think it's incidental that Ben Gurion imagined the demise of his national militarized state in the era of a woman. But Golda Meir also was his disciple, but she, this Joshua thing was not her bag. She didn't really, and she wasn't really, she was kind of much more kite, or kind of like diaspora culture. This whole kind of Bible boy thing was not really Golda's bag, which is, again, not to let her off the hook for many things that occurred in her own time, but she doesn't really, her term doesn't really fit in quite to this hyper male Joshua paradigm here.
So from Sherry, does Netanyahu actually use any of the Joshua language or imagery?
Yes, he does. And that is how the book begins. Quite significantly in 2015, seems like a world ago, but in 2015, when Obama was president, John Boehner invited Netanyahu to speak to Congress against Obama. And you have to read the scene in the book, but there he was, mostly before the Republican senators, and he reached hard for the for Joshua language and has used it fairly consistently, including in one of the passages towards the end of the book, in some Twitter wars that Netanyahu has had with Abu Mazen, the leader of the Palestinian National Authority. He's leaned hard again on the Joshua language. Right. What I will also say about Netanyahu is that he revived Ben-Gurion's biblical study group. So he dedicated this to his father-in-law, and he said, I am going to revive the prime minister's study group. But it Netanyahu's study group is not Ben-Gurion's study group. Ben-Gurion's study group, we can say a lot about it, but all of the guys really thought they were engaging in hard biblical scholarship. There's a lot to say about it, but they were the scientific method, at least in their imagination, was quite central to them. Netanyahu mostly convened a smattering of rabbis. And I know one biblical scholar who received an invitation, who tried to attend for quite a while just to make a point that there still was something like academic biblical studies. But she was quickly, and she's actually happens to be an expert on the book of Joshua, which is probably how she got the invitation. She was quickly drowned out by the voices of different settler rabbis, and ultimately no academic was present in that. But to answer Sherry's question, the language is alive and well with Netanyahu, and I wouldn't be surprised in the next couple of days as he begins his annexation language and process. I would not be surprised. I'll be listening hard, because I am sure that these words and images are going to be peppering his speeches.
Still from Dara, there's a question. You touched upon this, but to what extent does the masculinity of the Joshua narrative clash and or get woven into the new man rhetoric of the early kibbutzes?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yes, it's right there. And I think a great way to encapsulate how the new man image of the founders of kibbutzim, these collective agricultural settlements in pre-state, I think a perfect way to look at the intersection of that new man imagery and Joshua is in a single word, which is the word for pioneer, chalutzim. And chalutzim, in the book of Joshua, designates the infantry, those people who march out first in Joshua's army as part of the conquest. And that was the word taken up by the kibbutz founders to describe themselves. So this whole constellation of, being a founder, orienting yourself to geography through conquest and settling the land, kind of really perfectly intersects.
And this is from Eric. 30% is a lot of land. Where will the Palestinian population go? It sounds like some Bantu states.
Yeah, I think that is a pertinent and real analogy. And so, again, annexation is it's in a certain way, it's not something new. The Golan Heights have been annexed, and in the past, where we begin it, I guess we really do sort of begin it in 1967, but the encroachment has been so, first taking over Palestinian public lands, then private lands, private agricultural lands, then building a wall. that separates people from parts of their communities or from their fields or from their water source or from the pipes that take away their wastewater. So annexation, it's not something really new. It's an acceleration of the disenfranchisement and the walling and the fragmentation of this geography. What I call the whole place in the book is in fact Joshua land, a fragmented, ethnically and ideologically defined landscape. But to go right to Eric's question, so what's going on, you can also call it like the great squeeze. So taking agricultural lands, public lands, assuming private lands. And so the idea is literally to Palestinian cities into these like floating islands, so that there's no contact with other Palestinian communities, and that, they're sort of like walled off and squeezed in, and absolutely true, with no room for sort of like the natural growth of communities. So it absolutely is a kind of fragmentation, which, just to kind of put it out there, at the point at which things are so fragmented, so divided, so privatized, right, so divisive, it makes you wonder why anybody, other than those in the 1% or those who directly receives, why does anybody go along with it anymore? Right, at the point of sort of, all of these enclaves and these floating islands, why don't they declare autonomy and make alliances, as did, the tribes described in the book of Joshua? Why don't they make these kind of lateral alliances? Like, why not say enough to the state? That's kind of the idea I want to throw out there, is that, at this point of, alienation that happens on so many grounds, like, why hang on to the national paradigm anymore?
Yeah, there's a really good, this connects so closely, but it's from Ralph. And could you reflect on the trope of the nation state? In fact, for instance, that contemporary Israelis and Palestinians seem to be preoccupied in founding themselves in some nation state form. It kind of goes on, but why didn't the experience of the German nation state turn people away from statehood and nationalism?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Ralph. I think, as Ralph knows, I have something to say about this. And, maybe therein lies the greater tragedy of all of this. Because ultimately, these national movements, although there's a lot of good scholarship, sort of showing roots of Palestinian nationalism and showing roots of nationalism, I don't want to discount that. But I do want to sort of throw out that in terms of being quote unquote national movements, this really begins after World War I. And the short answer is that after World War I, under the imperial framework, there was no getting any kind of recognition unless you showed up and presented yourself like a nation. So I've done a lot of research, especially in like the teens and 20s. There were many different ideas about how to reconfigure the Middle East after the Ottoman Empire, right? How to think about geography, how to think about alliances, how to think about resources. They were plentiful and they're interesting. And, some I think are still 100 years later, I think are still interesting to consider today. But, if you showed up with a confederation idea, with socialist idea, God-first idea, with different sort of international or cross-ethnic, cross-religious formulations. And, these weren't marginal. Like in the 1920s, even Ben Gurion and King Faisal of Iraq, like even they had these ideas. These were not marginal ideas. But when it came time to presenting yourself before the League of Nations, right, before the Americans, the British, and the French, they were not going to until you presented yourself like a nation. So, the kind of deep tragedy of where we are now is that there was a kind of a land for the nation state form, and then its subsequent militarization, by European and American power at the same time. And many people on the line know this obsession of mine, right? But at the same time that those very people who were told be a nation or you won't be, also lost jurisdiction over those things flowing beneath their feet, by which I mean primarily like oil and minerals. So the wealth was claimed by empire, and the nation state was foisted upon them, and all these other ideas were simply erased.
There's a few more questions. Do you want to keep going, or how do you?
Yeah, clearly I'm on a roll. I could go all night.
All right.
Don't want to test the patience of my lovely audience, but I think 10 minutes, people. Shout out if you object.
There's some great questions here, Uvi. Great to hear your answers. So from Joseph, what will Biden do if annexation occurs?
Yes. Well, I think we sort of have a predictor. I wish my answer were better. But considering that there's still a campaign, I think there's some room to shape the policy. But, I think that, if we take the Obama administration as the guide, I think that there would be like reprimands, but not necessarily a reduction in funding. So, I think that there would be a stance, we don't support annexation, we support the two-state solution, but, nothing's going to change unless the funding structure changes. So, we saw some of that today with the proposal that is moving through the House of Representatives. So again, like if we use the Obama administration as the guide, they would say, no, that's not okay. We support the two-state solution, but it really doesn't have teeth unless it addresses, the multi-billion-dollar a year US funding of Israeli militarism and militarization. So what I would say, right, the campaign is still going. So it's a really important time in multiple ways to examine, where tax money goes, and raising a voice about that, I think, is quite valid, whether we're talking about what goes on in the city of Chicago or the United States, or what goes on with US funding. So I think that is to say, I think that, Biden wouldn't approve at this point, but I think that it's a really good moment as this campaign takes shape in these tumultuous times to play a role in shaping that policy.
So Virginia asks, can you talk more about the connection to water and your work with water?
Yes, thank you, Virginia. So although, again, it might not seem like water has anything to do with the book of Joshua, I found it in two ways. One way is there's a beautiful story taken from the book of Joshua, which is there's only two women in the whole book. And one of them really, Achsa Bat Kalib, she really does appear as this kind of figure of negotiating water rights for a mode of mutual survival. It's really a beautiful metaphor, and it's so exciting in the book of Joshua when, after the wars have been fought, this woman stands up and talks about how to distribute water so that people can actually live. So it's a beautiful moment. The book ends by really thinking about the environmental upshot of this Joshua mania. And there I look in at what's going on the Mediterranean coast at present. Are in 2020, and the coastal aquifer that runs beneath Gaza, where over 2 million people live, has effectively collapsed. Okay, so amidst this occupation, annexation, an aquifer, right? Ancient waters beneath the earth, it has collapsed. It is not potable. And at the same time that there is no viable water supply for the 2 million plus residents of Gaza, just about 15 kilometers up the coast is one of several water factories, desalination factories on the Israeli coast. And I'm going to do a little bit of shorthand because the private equity story that I uncovered in the conclusion is worth reading. But I'll give you the upshot. One fellow, Yitzhak Tshuva, owns most of the natural gas discovered beneath the Eastern Mediterranean and the desalination factories. One oligarch. So the way I put it in the book is, because the water pipe system was designed by Ben-Gurion as he was researching the book of Joshua. And, these were like socialized, nationalized, militarized water pipes. And what flows through them now is this privatized oligarchic water that is parasitic on the state water infrastructure to profit one individual who is so obscenely rich that all kinds of like insane Las Vegas hotels, I'm not even kidding, are realized with this money. So it's a disaster whatever your political orientation, a collapsed aquifer, over 2 million people with no water, and state subsidized, privatized drinking water that has been the price has been artificially depressed so that the oligarch can have the contracts, so that the state is dependent on this desalinated water. And my friend Toby Jones, I think, describes desalination really well. It's what you get by pouring oil on the sea. You've got the entire country of Israel, and Palestinians, for the most part, are not connected to these pipes, but Israelis are. And what's going to happen when the singular owner of their water decides to raise the price? It really, especially when I reached the end of the book and the environmental upshot of all of this Joshua mania is an untenable situation. I think really important because no matter who you are or what the political orientation is, with punishing climate change, with infrastructure controlled by a shrinking cadre of oligarchs, and with an increasing number of people with a shrinking horizon of possibility, like, where is this going to go? So I think that's the real wake-up call in all of this. Like, let's get to the second half of Joshua. Let's figure out, how to have decentralized alliances across ethnic, religious, and ideological, how to collaborate, hold things in common, and, actually try to get through.
So maybe one more question. Have you thought at all about alternative biblical characters who might offer a better or more locus of Israeli public memory than Joshua?
Thank you. Yes, great question. I have. And that is where digging through the second half of Joshua has really been a source of great ideas. One of them is a figure in the book of Joshua. She is Rahab of Jericho, and she is essentially like the Canaanite mother of these people. A figure who, knows how to make alliances, how to protect her household. This other woman that I mentioned, Achsa, who negotiates these water rights. But, even in the second half of the book of Joshua, I think again, kind of there's quite a few really like interesting redemptive moments for the present. And, one of them is it's like a throwaway line in the 15th chapter of Joshua, but it says, yeah, and until today, Jerusalem is divided between the people of Judah and the Jebusites. There's just this line, like we're all still living here. We just got through 12 chapters of genocide and conquest and expropriation. But, that was the story. And we're all living here in these divided cities and these compromised water sources, and we've got to figure it out. So ultimately, I really do in the book take the second half of the book of Joshua to really read it as this alternate narrative that is not nationalistic, not militaristic, but really speaks to something much more like a confederation or like a bioregional model of inhabitation. So really, the reason why I spent so many years of my life on this terrible book, besides, what was done to me in the fourth grade, is because I think that the self-same book, whose military narrative became so central in 20th century Israel, I think can actually provide a kind of a guide and a map for a 21st century outside of the defunct nation state form.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think we're done.
Okay, shouldn't we try to sell a book? Do people need information?
I think you have, yes, I think you have been selling the book. But yeah, yes, you can go to citylipbooks.com, and if you find that it's not available, just email me, Teresa at citylipbooks. We'll be happy to ship it to you, or you can pick it up curbside.
Okay, thanks so much, Eitan. Thanks so much, Teresa and Jordan and City Lit. Thank you, Princeton, and thanks, wonderful friends, for being here tonight.
Yes. Thanks, everybody.
It was a wonderful night. Thank you so much.